Good. So welcome everyone. I hope that you entered the Salon Insula 42. These are conversations that we organize in the framework of what we call Salons Incubators, European Incubators. And I'm very, very happy to welcome today Mercedes Giovinazzo and François Matarasso as conversation partners. Thank you so much, Mercedes and François, for having accepted this invitation. Now, I'm going to start very abruptly because we will have 1 hour of conversation. And as I explained to Mercedes and François, we do want this conversation to be very informal and extremely relaxed, but the situation we are in culture in Europe is not completely relaxed. And even though we try very much to find solutions to it, there is a need, a very profound need for speaking about what really matters, in fact, and in which way we, people from the cultural system, are supposed to think and ponder about the situation that the pandemie created for the cultural system. I very much like the fact that François started his blog due to pandemie, and he has this phrase saying, thinking about culture as if people mattered. And in fact, this is a very good introduction to my first question to the guests that I have in front of me. I'm not going to lose a lot of time by presenting them to you because they are on our Facebook presented with their bios. The only thing I want to say about both of them is that they have a very, very broad international experience concerning culture, and their expertise is, in my opinion, extremely important and precious. So I'm happy that we can share this with you today. So my first question would be the following. Yesterday, there was this recovery plan coming from the European Union addressing the way in which countries are going to recover after the pandemic. And immediately I saw a reaction from Culture Action Europe saying, yes, indeed, the importance of this recovery plan is something that cannot be neglected. However, when it comes to culture, education, and youth, the requests that were made by organizations very active in the cultural field were not met by this recovery plan. And the question I address is the following. Why is it so difficult, and was always so difficult, to explain why culture is so important? Whenever we were working, and this you both know, Mercedes and François, whenever we were working and putting forward arguments in order to explain why, in fact, culture is a key to social cohesion, it is a key to democracy, it is a key for better understanding, better connecting, better living, it's always very difficult to convince politicians, those people who have resources, make decisions, that in fact culture is key. It is, and it is something without which societies don't live well. Why do you think? And I'm asking this more general question so that we can understand better why even today culture and education, the soft powers, are seen as secondary in terms of intervention for the recovery plan. Mercedes?
Wow, Corina, I had hoped in my deepest being that you would start with François.
But look, Mer, I'm going to reformulate this also in the following way. what did this pandemic situation reveal again about the role that culture plays, the way in which the status of culture in the European societies, and how this is perceived? I mean, what did it really point to again and again and again?
Okay, so I'll take your question, and you know, throw myself into the pool and hope it's not empty. That I find you know, I find that the question is fundamental, and I'm going to speak off the top of my head, Corina. You know that, I mean,
please do.
There's nothing prepared here. I find that the issue is extremely complex, and we have a tendency to, unfortunately, you know, try to simplify things too much. And I think that, you know, we should take on also a certain degree of responsibility as people, professionals that are or have been and will continue to be involved in the cultural sector as professionals. The discourse, I think, cannot be reduced, unfortunately, to the economic value of culture as it is, on the one hand, or to the other extreme, reduced to the value of culture and the arts per se, you know, because they have a value. It's much more complex than that. As you know, I am a firm believer that culture is a backbone of, you know, or of what is meant by human sustainable development. I do consider that culture is something that, when practiced, not only that you have access to, but that you practice, contributes in a very profound and meaningful way to shape the human being in its most profound aspects, and that it gives the capacity of a very critical approach, definitely, to life in general, to society, to the world, whatnot. So I am always a bit frustrated seeing that, unfortunately, I mean, you know, I am starting to be of a certain age, and that it's, you know, 25 years since I'm around in this, maybe a little bit more already, that the discussion is always the same. We need more money. We need more money. The tweet yesterday by Culture Action Europe, I saw it. It's about the multi-annual financial framework. We have obtained for Creative Europe less than requested by the Commission, by the Parliament, by the sector, etc. That's all fine. That's incredible, you know, and that was what Culture Action Europe was initially, as you know better than I do, born to do. But still, I don't think it is enough. It's not enough to put forward. It's only this message. And I do think that for many reasons that it is very difficult for me to, you know, grasp. It is extremely complicated, difficult for this sector to position itself in a much more political stance vis-a-vis the rest of the actors in a whatever governance system. We are not duly, completely part of the governance system. I remember when you were nominated Minister of Culture, you told me, I am the last one on the table, at the far end of the
absolutely.
table.
Culture is the last on the row. Yeah, that's true.
Symbolism is important in institutions. So when you are not given a certain position and a certain, you know, how can I say, voice, either you fight for it, or I find that you are used as the cherry on the cake, but nothing less. And I do think that, you know, we make a mistake. I've been saying this, but I also admit that we have always failed. And I will give you a very short example and then I'll end. My experience when we tried with a lot of energy, goodwill, resilience and whatnot, to include some aspect relating to culture in the 2030 agenda for development, the UN 2030 agenda. Well, you know, I have to say it out loud, we failed. We failed because of a lot of reasons, which are intrinsic to the sector, but also about the way that we are perceived outside. We are not perceived as naggers. We are not perceived as having a political value. We are not perceived as making a difference in certain, let's say, agendas. And we are reduced, and that's why I'm giving this example, to what is tangible. In the case of the UN's 2003 agenda is basically, you know, tangible heritage.
Yeah.
And the rest we are sort of mentioned here and there, and, you know, sometimes and not very clearly in urban agendas and education and gender. We cannot be reduced to that. I don't think so. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. That's very important. So we are so important that we become invisible. It's like we speak about it a lot, and then when it comes to, okay, so we are so important, what's the translation of it? All of a sudden we realize that, as you say, we failed. François?
I don't see it the way that you do. First
Good.
of all, for two reasons. First of all, I don't agree that culture is seen as unimportant. I had my first job in the cultural sector 41 years ago. At the time, I was living and working in the UK. There were 3 TV channels. If you wanted to, in most towns, if you wanted to buy a book or a record, you would go to a general department store because there wasn't any specialist or a newsagent. There was no arts programming. The critics, in terms of publishing, there would be a few pages of reviews in the back page of the paper. The cultural sector has expanded enormously in the 40 years of my career, and the last book that I wrote has a deliberately slightly provocative title, a subtitle, which is How Participation Won and Why It Mattered.
Yeah.
And so when I was leaving school, going to university, very few people would have wanted their children to become an actor or a musician or to an artist. Mm-hmm. Today, it's one of the most parents are very happy at the idea that their child. The status of culture has never been higher. What you're really talking about is the political status of culture, and that's a fundamentally different question. Yeah, our politicians do not understand the place that culture holds in everyday life across all of our countries. And if you wanted to see that, there's a very obvious example just in how people have lived through the lockdown and the pandemic. They have turned to culture in massive ways, in all kinds of ways, you know, from singing and playing music to each other spontaneously on their balconies, at their doors, to news programs reciting poetry at the end of their bulletins. There is I could go on endlessly, but it would be pointless. The real problem you're talking about is how politicians think about culture, and it is not the same as how the population thinks, and they just have not caught up. But they haven't caught up in so many ways with how the population thinks. It's not just culture. So that's one way I see it differently. The second, I'm afraid I'm not a believer in culture. I don't think it's always good. Culture is a fundamental and very powerful human force. You can't be a human being without having a cultural and artistic life. I've never met anybody that didn't, because culture is how we understand our experience in the world, how we create values and meanings and share them with other people. But the values and the meanings that we create aren't always good. So the fundamental thing is that we have to be able to have access to the capabilities to create and engage with culture. But that's a separate thing from what we then do with that. So again, I think we don't help ourselves when we speak in quasi-religious terms to politicians about the importance of culture. I'm not also saying we need to speak to them in utilitarian terms, but I am saying that we need to speak to them about the fundamental importance of culture in defining our social values.
And François, I mean, it's in a way, despite, in my perspective, in a way, despite appearances, you are saying more or less the same thing, but explaining it in a different kind of configuration. The only question I would ask you is precisely, right, okay, so this is the case. And why, specifically, when you say, look, everyone turned to culture when pandemia came, and this is a proof that this is needed. And however, in terms of support, of resources, of political awareness of the importance of culture, even politicians had this kind of very concrete example, they did not consider that this is a translation of a real need, a profound need that has to be supported more with resource. Why do you think this happens?
I think the change is happening and will happen. So what I've described in the change in social attitudes, and it's not just it's longer than my career. It started in the post-war period, but I would make a parallel between that and education. So if you go back to the middle of the 19th century, in the richest, most powerful countries in the world, which were then Britain and France, only about 25% of children got any primary education. Today, Brazil, India, China, 100% education. Nobody questions the importance of education and access to education. We see it as a fundamental developmental and human right. And I think the same will happen with how we understand and think about culture, but it takes a long time for politicians to change their perspectives, because in the middle of the 19th century in Britain, there were plenty of politicians who argued against giving education to working class children because it would just give them ideas above their station in life. They weren't supposed to be able to read. They were just supposed to be able to go and work in a factory. So this is a big, deep change that is happening. Now, specifically the political problem is that political discourse is still locked into certain sets of ideas from the 19th century, and so is cultural discourse. So when we still have a culture which is steeped in ideas from the Enlightenment about how art should be universal and transformative and non-materialistic and profoundly transcendental, and also sometimes that only the most cultivated can appreciate it, it is not surprising that politicians who are brought up in a culture which consciously and unconsciously reflects those values, it's not surprising if politicians think, well, culture is a rarefied thing and it's not really important. But it's a mismatch between reality and perception, in my view.
Right. So you remember that you were saying that your perspective is going to be more pessimistic, but basically, in a way, now I see, Mercedes, that François is more optimistic than we are. Mer, any comments on what François just said before I pass to my second question?
I think that, as you were saying, Corina, despite the difference in expressing the thoughts, I think that we ultimately agree, because I am no firm believer in the religious power of culture. I think that it can be very negative sometimes, and has always been. You take it back to the 19th century, we can take it back, I don't know how many thousand of years. It's been a terrible, incredible instrument of power and of manipulation as well. So I am not a firm believer, you know, in the intrinsic. Again, I was talking about intrinsic value per se of culture, arts, relating to a very definite notion that came out exactly when you were saying in the 19th century, never before in the history of humankind, not because art, culture were meant to be socially valid because of many other reasons. I mean, theater or painting, you know, it's a narrative. It's completely different. So I think that we agree. I'm not sure that, you know, I follow your thought completely. Is that if the people are capable of, then since it's the people that vote for their politicians, it would follow in a very simple syllogism that the politicians are the representation of the people and therefore should, you know, be. Now that's where the hiatus, which I never find, you know, not with regards to culture, it's not that, it's in general. I always tend to say we have the governments we deserve because we vote for them. What are we complaining about? So I'm not sure that, you know, on that little twist, I follow you. And one last thing, it's that in Europe, at least, you know, Corina started mentioning the European Union and what is happening now. The European Union is, to my understanding, not yet a project which has been completed. And it's in between, you know, the intergovernmental and the supranational. And what in certain, you know, very limited aspects, it has this supranational power. It does not have the devolution of very fundamental and structural, essences, not essences, but elements, sorry, of governments, which are basically, you know, defense and foreign affairs. They've never been devolved. Other things like slightly, but this never yet. And we're dealing with an issue of sovereignty. It's member states are those that you still, you know, have to have their say. And culture is even worse. That's what I was saying, you know, it's a paradox. It's almost a cherry on the cake because, you know, for culture, it's the principle of subsidiarity. So it's like, you know, it's never ending spiral. So stop here. I'm
going to immediately connect to what you were saying, Mercedes, because my second question is in relation to that, and it's a question precisely saying the following: what we witnessed during this period of pandemia was that, in fact, European countries turned back immediately to their own national state type of help. If this pandemic came before the European Union existed, it would have been, I mean, each nation state in Europe would have reacted on a national basis. So in fact, in what way Europe gains in this process? Who is the loser in this process? What kind of situation is this kind of situation when basically we see Germany, France reacting so generously to what's going on, and countries like Spain, Romania, Italy having a problem in responding at the same level and in the same way. And in relation to that, I would like you to comment also upon the role of the state, because a lot of comments come from the idea that the role of the state is going to be reinforced by this situation, because the state starts to become, in fact, the general manager, le gestionnaire général, the one who's managing and helping and giving directions and deciding about priorities. So basically, we are in a way in a situation in which the nation state in Europe starts again to be very, very powerful. And where is culture in all this, and where is the European response in all this. François, I'll start with you this time.
Okay, I mean, it's disappointing that the European response wasn't possible. But one of the problems with complaints about the European responses is that actually they're directed at the European Union, but they should be directed at the national governments, because it's always the national governments that prevent the European Union from acting together. So I don't know, and I haven't yet thought enough and worked out what I think about why that is happening. What I will say, I think that the danger that you highlight is real. I think now that the initial shock has passed and we are starting to get used to living in the condition of pandemic, I mean, it's extraordinary that, I mean, if nobody would have thought 6 months ago that you could make us all stay in our homes and not go to work. It's extraordinary. There's a really brilliant essay by Bruno Latour, which was published at the end of March, when he's asking what kind of world do we want to have now. And one of the things that he said is that as an ecologist, he's somebody who's been saying to politicians about climate change for decades, and they keep saying, oh, but we can't stop the system, the economy. And suddenly he says, we discovered there was a big button that you could press and stop everything. But I think, so we're past the initial shock, and I can see three visions, three contrasting and to some extent competing visions of what might come next. So there are other people who want to get back to normal, as they did after 2008. I think they were wrong in 2008. This time, I don't only think they're wrong, I think they are misguided. They're delusional, frankly, because normal doesn't exist. It's not an available option. The system, I mean, if we go back to the question of culture, for instance, the entire economic model for the performing arts is devastated by social distancing.
Yeah.
So you just can't anticipate a time when we will be able to work in that way again. Not safely. You can't anticipate it safely. So I think there are two contrasting alternatives that I see being advocated from different sides. One is and you'll forgive the use of the phrase, take back control. The Brexit, that the national governments will want to close borders. I mean, we already have had borders closed in Europe for the first time in more than 20 years. So closed borders, controls over populations and so on, and populations accept such controls when they're frightened, always. That's the only way to accept people. When people are frightened, they accept curtailments of their freedoms. So that's one. The other is a new world. People who say, okay, we have stopped. It's like Bruno Latour. That's exactly what he's saying. So we did press the button. We did stop the overproducing economy. Now that we have stopped, he's asking, what do we want to start again? And what do we not want to start again? And there's a lot of people who have experienced social solidarity during these months, who are looking for a more sustainable, less consumer-oriented economy, a different form of social relations. I have no idea which of those alternatives will will win out, and it may be that different ones win out in different countries. But I think that it's really important that if we prefer one rather than the other, we are prepared to engage in the political task of ensuring that out of this we can build the world that we want to see, rather than the one that might be imposed on us.
Mercedes? So also because François answered in a certain way my question about the nation state and its becoming again a sort of a national response to the crisis, and also this question about so where is Europe in all this, in the European response, but also the way in which the state becomes again a main, very important stakeholder, even in the private enterprise and in everything that really is in relation to society. The state becomes again the main actor in Europe. And I mean, well, François gave a more holistic answer than that. What do you think about this?
I think that François touched on a very important thing from my point of view, which has worried me very, very profoundly since the beginning of this whole pandemic. You know, which, as François said 6 months ago, we could hardly think, you know, that we would be in this situation. It's the issue of fear. I do think that fear is, as culture, also an instrument of power. The more people are afraid, the more people tend to be to accept being put in a position, you know, that you need to be guided. You need superior entity that not only gives meaning to your life, but that enables you, you know, to address your daily quandaries and issues and whatever. You know, human beings have had religion, you know, have had other sources of, you know, the inspiration or this idea of protection. In our more not religious, you know, societies, well, it is true that since 19th century at least, you know, the state is the state with, you know, the very, how can I say, disruptive and dramatic, you know, extremes that we saw in the 20th century, you know, with the totalitarian systems, by the way, you know, all derived in any, you know, however you look at it, that it be Spain or the Soviet Union, from the left. It's a misinterpretation of socialism that gives, you know, this idea of the people and the state. Having said this, the second thing is that, again, from this fear, you tend to accept, and you know, the choice that has been put to people in the very beginning of all this about health, security, you know, well, where are my rights in all this? You know, where do I stand? Why, because of health and security issues, do I have to let go of? I can do it for a certain amount of time, but maybe not all the time. Why am I in a disposition to think that the superior entity will solve everything for me? Which brings me to what you were saying about the EU. Who's going to pay for all this? It's us, the taxpayers. I mean, let's not, you know, think that it's based on a solidarity principle, which is great. I mean, I'm not the one who's going to discuss this, nor you know, think that this is wrong, but it's our collective taxpayers' money that goes into a common pot and is redistributed, that France and Germany, you know, are capable of showing that they're, you know, the leaders of generosity. Well, yeah, sure. You know, let's not forget that Germany was saved also by taxpayers' money after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done a thing. So, you know, it's again, you know, it's how you manipulate data, how you address messages, how good you are at convincing people that you're in the right. And that is fundamental. When people are in fear, you have to tell them, no, but I'm right. I know what to do. I'm right. I will guide you. There's no question. Then there's no question. It's full stop. And it brings me back to my last thing. That's where I become very frustrated with us people in the cultural sector, because I do think that, we should be more vocal about all this. Going back to what François was saying, the political in all this. Well, let's not dupe ourselves. It's not only about, it is, of course, about organizations, small cultural businesses closing, and, the disruption of a system. Definitely. But I would be more for what François was saying. I would be more, I don't believe it, our politicians here in Spain say the new normal. And I'm like, what? Normal is normal. It's not new nor old. It's normal, I would much rather think about, what is the new world? And that's where the creative thinking comes in, where taking, up for principles and values is important, because it is about, I agree, totally. It's about what we will be able to do that will make sense, not only for us, but, those that come after us, the younger ones, because it's somehow I feel that, of course, it's not comparable, but we will be in a sort of post-war situation, not a classical war as, us human beings as a species have seen throughout history. No. It's not about buildings falling down or I don't know, farms and what, being burned down and no crops or, no, it's not about that. It's different. But nevertheless, I'm profoundly convinced that the result is like, you have to pick up yourself after a war, and you have to imagine what will come afterwards, not think back. And I'm afraid, and here I will finish, that this whole issue of fear, since you have a higher entity that, takes care of you, well, okay, I'm fine. I don't have to think. That's fine. Somebody will solve it for me. I don't have to think about what is coming up and how I can make a change. And that's where I think that we should, take on some responsibility. Yeah.
Right. So that's very good. I remember that when I was in New York, one of the first works of art done by a contemporary young artist was a red wall on which was written, "Fear is a bad advisor." But it's a useful advisor as far as the controlling, let's say, structures are concerned. And now, because Mercedes, you were speaking, and I'm going to ask you to comment upon two of your own in relation to what we were saying now. I would ask both of you to comment upon something that you had in your articles or in the two things that I read recently by both of you. François, I would like you to comment upon this idea that you had, which is very much linked to what also Mercedes said, in regard to the fact that whatever we say and however we speak about solidarity now in the cultural sector, it is clear that when resources are going to be lesser, still some will feel more entitled to have resources as compared to others, without taking into account the fact that, in fact, the cultural ecosystem is composed by this balance. You need smaller organizations like you need bigger organizations. It's not just a competition on resources. So I would like you very much to comment on that, upon that. And of course, Mercedes, if she wants to. And then Mercedes, moving forward to your comparison regarding the war, after the war, you have this very good and strong assertion in the small article I read. You say that we now also have to face what is happening. Instead of putting things under a carpet, it's just like during Holocaust. We knew, in fact, Europeans knew this was happening, and they didn't really take sides. Will we take sides? of course, this is in relation to this kind of courage you speak about. We have to take sides. We have to take sides. It's again a sort of a crucial moment. And like then, instead of putting something that we don't want to see aside, we need to face it in order to be able to move forward. So how would you both comment upon these two things, which for me are very important? François?
Well, if I speak about the culture as an ecosystem, it has grown enormously, as I said, during my professional life. There are far more people living successfully as artists in different ways than there were. And actually, the people who run cultural institutions are much better paid today in absolute terms than they would have been in the 1980s. So, but that has grown on a particular model, an economic model that has been the dominant model since the 1980s, model around consumption. There are, at the moment, in different countries, I see campaigns to save the theatre or save orchestras. But the people who are most vulnerable at the moment are not the orchestras, they're the musicians. They're not the theatres, they're the actors. Because they're the people who suddenly had all their work disappear overnight. And each one of them is an ecosystem in itself, because a violinist will play in an orchestra, she might play in a chamber music ensemble, she might teach, she might also perform at weddings. All of these things have stopped at once. And if, as seems likely, there is going to be an unavoidable disruption of the cultural economy and the cultural ecosystem, not only because there's not enough money, because Germany, for instance, has put up a very large amount of money for its cultural sector. And Germany and France, where the cultural institutions earn much less of their income than in the UK. So they might be saved to some extent by the relatively generous public funding. But it doesn't matter if they're saved and unable to open. Yeah. They'll just stand there and rot. So the question for me is, and it's a really difficult question, but it is for the ministries of culture, arts councils, foundations, it may well be, how do we manage decline? How do we manage contraction? Do we simply allow the law of the jungle to operate, and the ones who are biggest and strongest fight their way to the resources? Or do we actually try to find ways to cut back, which means that the ecosystem as a whole has a chance of surviving, and which also ensure a greater degree of social justice and equitable distribution of hardship, given that hardship seems to be unavoidable.
And also the preservation, François, if I allow myself to say, the preservation of what was achieved in the last decades, because this evolution was something that was achieved, and we now, if we're going to come back with this very wild, savage kind of logic, we are going to sacrifice rights and dynamics that were achieved and which are not for granted. Mercedes? Yeah, sorry?
No, just a quick comment. We absolutely have to protect rights that were achieved. Some of the activities or institutions I'm not so concerned about, because I think some of them are unsustainable.
Yeah, I understand, but precisely, but it's the values, it's the rights that have to be protected. Mer?
I would start from that. I have this feeling that what is under threat very profoundly is the governance systems that we have currently in Europe in general, and in the Western world in general, that are the result and the fruit of, you know, what happened after Second World War, which goes from the human rights to, you know, the let's say the structuring of very strong systems that abide by the rule of law, democratic rule of law, human rights, those three things basically. Sorry, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. I think that this is what is under threat right now. Understanding whether the system will implode, or even if it's stretched to a maximum, you know, it will still sustain. It will still pull through. If it pulls through, then, you know, the new world, we might be, I hope, positive about it, with all its differences, ups and downs, whatever. If it implodes, then we're in for a lot of trouble. And you made me think, both of you, of yesterday, I was reading, I can't remember his name, sorry. He's a Mexican philosopher who lives here in Spain. And the journalist asked him, you know, what do you think about what is happening in Europe and you know, all these nationalist trends, populist trends, actually, rather, no, and in particular in Spain. And he said, it's very simple. A human being does not necessarily decide using its cortex. In certain situations, especially when in fear, it's a reptilian brain that will choose for him. And we come back to, you know, I need the higher entity that will tell me how to do, because it's my defense mechanism. So it boils down to that, you know, I think position that many people have, and whether we like it, you know, I know it's a blockbuster, but Harari says it in his first book, you know, the DNA of the human being has not changed radically in these 450,000 years since our species exists. It's basically the same. We're basically the same human being that we were when we transformed ourselves from the sedentary, from what is it? Hunters gatherers. That's how our brain functions. And culture, you know, is indeed, in that sense, in a philosophical sense, a superstructure, which comes on top, and you're like, yes, well, how deep down has it really, you know, trickled? When you're faced with an essential dilemma, either, you know, fight or flight, it's not your rational cultural being that will start. Yeah, will
but
be your
primitive one, the reptilian
exactly.
brain that takes over.
So this brings me to the last issue. I hope that we will all be capable not of competing for resources, but of applying, you know, solidarity principles, as we have seen applied again, you know, since the mid last century, because that is what has made us move forward also collectively, and not only, not necessarily only individually, but collectively. And I had a conversation with well, like, I consider him by now a friend. He's in charge of a very big cultural institution, and his dilemma right now is around this. He told me, I'm thinking and thinking and thinking, because since organizations like the one I work for will most possibly, and I'm not going in whether they're sustainable or not, or they're necessary or not, but they will survive because of a political will, because, you know, it's the flagship thing that has to remain, even if it's unsustainable. It's not his case, I think, but still, you know, irrespectively of, they will survive. The rest, you know, of us, including myself, you know, we will see what happens. And he was saying, I have to start thinking very profoundly how I can work in a solidarity system by which, through my privileged position, I can help the ecosystem to, if not completely, you know, because that's, you know, a big word, but still, you know, go on. So I thought that was very beautiful in a way of thinking. Huh?
And it's the sense in which also François was in fact writing about the fact that these kind of institutions and a cultural organization who will survive have to take responsibility themselves for the ecosystem. Because so in relation to this, I'm going to move on to this relationship between culture and democracy and culture and diversity. And then François was speaking to me about his experience in Târgu Mureș, where he went in January this year, and that he experienced there directly this relationship between culture and the opportunity of diversity, which he said diversity is a fact. It's not something that we have to, you know, build up on. No, it's a fact, and we have to let it be. And just by letting it be, we can build up on more democratic society. So a little bit of comment on this relationship. Why is this so important, the relationship between culture and democracy? Remember this famous phrase about culture can live without democracy, but democracy cannot live without culture. Mercedes, because you're continuing on this path, huh? No?
I don't know. I do agree with François. You know, if he said that diversity exists, it exists. You know, let's not discuss it. It's I think that I have always thought, even, you know, when I was possibly not capable of still, you know, rationalizing it too clearly, I was always surprised when people ask me, you know, where are you from? Are you more this or are you more that? You know, well, you know, at least Corina knows I come from a mixed background. So are you more this? Are you more that? And that was ages ago. Imagine today, you know, asking a kid who, you know, you are what you are. You are what you are. I think that, again, there's an issue, which is diversity stands on its own, or should stand, and should not be necessarily used nor confused with something which is very different. It's not because I have a mixed background that I carry 3 or 4 passports or identity cards. And I'm relating to get to the issue of citizenship within nation states as the ones we live in today. Huh? Citizenship is what gives me, as myself, an Italian citizen, the right to vote and to exercise my social political rights in a given context. Has nothing to do with my diversity, cultural.
It's two different things. But do you think, but Mercedes, do you think from this point of view that diversity is endangered? This kind of cultural diversity is endangered or can be endangered by the situation we are in as an outcome of this kind of need to tame whatever is different, precisely in order to control better and in order to have a more secure way of living.
Yeah, I don't have the answer. I will answer through an example or a counter question. Do we think that what is happening in the United States with the Hispanic population, slowly growing, the country becoming ever more bilingual, therefore ever more diverse with respect to, you know, the old WASP that was the elite, the governing elite. That's sheer demography. That is the pressure of people changing the context, which means that they bring their mixed culture, their diversity, etc., into a system that might or might not, as we know it today, go through. It might change. We have to be open to the idea that it might change. I hope that in terms of democratic governance, it won't change, but still, it's a possibility. And I think that in Europe, it should be the same thing. You know, I want to be positive. I hope that the children and the grandchildren of the Erasmus are those that tell me today, I feel that I'm, you know,
global.
But I would like to have a EU passport. Then I can say I'm an EU citizen, but I'm from, speak that, have lived here, moved there, whatever, with my small, you know, knapsack of my personal life. That's what I would. That's what I would want my new world to be in political terms and in citizenship terms. Yeah.
Great, François. This is the moment when François will say, I don't see things like you do.
No,
No.
I do, but I also see the aspiration to be a European citizen as another example of the inevitable cultural diversity of human beings, because lots of people don't want to be a European citizen. I'm a citizen of a country which has just been the first to leave the European Union. Look, it seems to me, as I say, an inescapable fact. Human diversity is an inescapable fact. We are not the same, and we don't all agree. And that we in Europe have the particularly important historical lesson of having spent most of the 20th century trying to kill each other because of those differences, having spent most of the preceding centuries trying to kill other people because of their differences. I think we always face a very straightforward choice. We either kill each other or we live with each other. It's that simple. And all of the actions that we take that encourage defensiveness, that feed the reptilian brain, that encourage our fear of the other, eventually always lead to us killing each other. The real value of culture, or one of the values of culture, is that it can create a space in which we can meet each other. And that's one of the lessons of Târgu Mureș, of Transylvania. It's by no means infallible, but if Romanians can go to the Hungarian theatre and Hungarians can go to the Romanian theatre, and they don't have to like each other's culture, but they do have to accept the legitimate place of each other's culture. And culture is a territory within which it is reasonably safe and enjoyable to encounter each other, you know. So
right. So your answer would be that this is in fact the space where the more this kind of space disappears, the less this kind of inclusive society is in fact possible.
No, it can be that kind of culture, but it can be that. But it's really, really important to remember that culture is as often used as a weapon to distinguish one group from another group, to say we're better than their group because of look at our cultural treasures, look at our. So when the Yugoslav National Army opened fire on the National Library in Sarajevo, it was an absolute assault on the culture of Bosnia. Yeah. So these are not straightforward, and culture can be misused as a way to oppress other people, just as easily as it can be a space in which other people can meet. And those of us who believe in Mercedes' holy trinity of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, we have to make sure that culture is a space that protects those three things.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's beautiful.
That's very, indeed, it's very beautiful and very strong. And now, before asking Rarița to come in with her comment, and afterwards we will end the salon, I would like to ask both of you, what, in your opinion, would be, from a cultural point of view, the worst scenario from getting out of pandemia? What's, for you, the worst that can happen from a cultural point of view?
I would just say fascism. Fascism in the broadest sense.
Yeah,
which
in a
we have
generic
understanding.
sense. And you,
Yes.
Maria?
Totally agree. Totally, totally. It was that. No, when I heard, I said, "Oh, I wanted to say that." No, it's that. That's the risk. That is the risk.
Right. So, Rarița, you can come on with this comment that the Cluj Cultural Center. Well, please present a little bit the Cultural Center too, because that's important.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for this conversation, because, you know, these days I've been involved intensively in a lot of conversations about culture and about the importance of culture, but it's especially now under pressure, the arguments have to be very much reduced to those radical points that you both mentioned in the beginning, and which culture is not about. So I'm so relieved to be able to hear those arguments that you are laying down, and I'm starving for more occasions of this type of conversation that will also help us in the cultural sector to trust more in the values that we are building our work on. And well, it's been so inspiring that it's kind of difficult to choose shortly what to share with you. Because Corina, you asked to present shortly what we do in Cluj Cultural Center. Cluj Cultural Center is more of a coalition of 104 entities at the local level in the city of Cluj. Mainly cultural organizations, but also universities, all the universities in the city, the local administration, the regional administration, and some of the representatives of the business community in the city, in this attempt of putting culture at the center of processes in the city that can bring a new understanding of culture and can bring new angles of approaching problems of the city at the social level and not only. So we are more or less developed as a result of bidding for the European Capital of Culture title. As you may know, the city of Cluj did not get a title, but it may be a lucky, you know, we got the short stick, but the lucky one in the sense that still being committed to implementing the program that we developed in a very collaborative process, we managed to actually set up a machinery, a context that is able to address and in a more structured way strategic role for culture in the city. And from here, I would add to the arguments that you have already laid down on the table in the conversation when we were talking about Europe and how the response at different levels has happened these days. And historically, for me, it was a very interesting comeback these days, because, you know, like maybe 10, 15 years ago, our advocacy efforts in the cultural field were very much targeted at the national level, because this is where the resources were, and this is where we could gather in a critical mass. And then during at least the last 10 years, I think I've seen how this process has been withdrawing in a sense locally and then expanding Europeanly. So at one level, we've seen that the importance of the nation state as the big policymaker for culture has changed a little bit. It's much more rigid and more difficult to model. And then, at least in Cluj, we saw the possibility of thinking of modalities, of methods to mobilize the local resources. And I think the model of the Cluj Culture Center is quite interesting from that perspective, that it brings together actors from the cultural field with other actors in other fields and doing something together for the city, which I think already speaks much more relevantly about these values that culture has and that you have been mentioning so illustratively until now. And I would give an example on how we try to bring this also at European level. There's a network that we've started, which is called Culture Next. It's a network of cities that, just like Cluj, went through a process of bidding for the European Capital of Culture, winning or losing, that's not the point, but it's rather that there is a commitment in those cities to use culture as a strategic component in their in the way they are governing their cities. And as an example of initiative that started from this is the Cities Fund. So because we realized that the power should not only lay with the national and the European structure, so we were looking how can cities that are now networked in Europe can together come up with their own models of supporting culture that is relevant at their level, but connected Europeanly, so not thinking only locally. So our first pilot is this fund where each city puts in an amount of money, and together we are addressing issues that are relevant for culture and local social transformation. That's an example to see how we are exploring this. And maybe as a last idea, I tell you, I'm tempted of speaking as long as you did so far, is that I find really important that we treasure in these moments the capacity of the cultural sector to question whatever is given now in our society. I think the entire situation has pushed everyone into rethinking. I mean, we were playing with these future scenarios, exercises for years. And I think now everybody understands the role of it. But I would like to, like, if we were to save something, I find it's really important to save this capacity, to nourish this capacity of the arts to question things and to renew things, to think new models. And I'm afraid that this is a dimension that is the least included in the, in the saving plans. I think, as Francois mentioned, I think it's easier to come up with plans to save institutions. It's very difficult to think of plans to address the immediate needs of individuals, like you mentioned, the individuals that play in orchestras that now are completely left without those 5-10 contracts that they were making a living out of. And then how this creativity and how the creativity of those very small experimental groups is going to be safeguarded in this period. For me, that's a big challenge. And then to finish up my intervention now, my question back to you would be the opposite of what Corina asked, is what would be, your best case scenario, maybe that one thing that you would like that we learn and keep and build up for culture, with culture in this process after this stage.
Thank you, Rita. That was very interesting. For me, to answer your question, the best case scenario is that we end up with more and more capability for people to make culture themselves at precisely at a city level, at a community level, and that it is a culture which speaks to the city, to the community, to the people who are making it. And when I say speaks to it, it has an importance to how they are living their lives. It is much less concerned with the status of the hierarchies of the art world, and is principally concerned with what role it is playing in everyday life. And the one reason for being optimistic is that, as I say, I think, and I've written about this elsewhere, there are good reasons why this has already been happening for the last 5 decades. And I think it is not a reversible trend, not in the short term, because it is rooted in changes to how people see themselves, how they see their relationship to art and culture, what they want out of life, the resources that they have, because they're now much better educated than they were 50 or 100 years ago. All of those things combine to make the conditions in which many more people see art and culture as part of their everyday lives and feel empowered to act in it in ways that sustain them and their neighborhoods.
Mercedes?
Thank you, Raritza. Thank you for your thoughts and for sharing. My best case scenario, which does not in any way, contradict François's best case scenario, for me would be that culture finally becomes a structural element of governance systems. And by that I mean that it is taken seriously in policymaking as an element that contributes to the well-being of society and to its development. And having said that, I would say that that best case scenario for me would be, well, this does not necessarily have to happen only at city level. Well, maybe we're a bit better at it. It should not happen at regional level, where I don't know if it's existent or not, depending on on the different countries. It should not only happen at state level. It should happen at this level, at least as far as we are concerned, now of the EU, in the sense that it has, not in the sense that would be for me really the best that could happen out of this chaos in which we are submerged right now.
Right, so basically, if I understand well, despite the fact that we were all expecting to have less optimistic scenarios, we do end up with this kind of faith into something that can be done. And I will just thank you very much, Raritza. I will just, before thanking the two of you very much, and also Raritza and the Cluj Cultural Center, which is a unique organization for the time being in Romania, and indeed it like Raritza said, it's very important that yes, they had the small stick, but at the same time this might have been an opportunity for them, because this is how they can really organically develop without the brouhaha of the cultural capital that sometimes is a very, very big challenge and not in the service of culture. I will end by using, because all this conversation made me remember about another work of art which existed and exists in New York. I don't know if any of you saw it. It's called The Earth Room by Walter de Maria. It's a very beautiful work of art. It's just a room filled with black, juicy earth. And each time it's entertained in the sense that this kind of earth will it will germinate. This is where everything will come from. So when you enter that place, it's very, you feel like there is where nurture exists, there is where nurturing is, there is where this happens. It's exactly like why we should entertain this kind of, the concept of this work of art. I loved it because it gave you the sense of all the possibilities. It's just the earth, but then this is what you have to nourish. This is where you have to put water. Putting water on this earth and keeping this earth being alive means that there's always a possibility. So I'm just ending this salon. Thank you, Mercedes, and thank you, François, and thank you, Raritza, with a phrase from François who says, hope is a virtue, not a mood. Thank you all, Elena, Juana, everyone who followed us, and see you very soon.
Mulțumesc, huh?
Great.